for all your comments.
88 to 91 FM, BBC Radio 2.
Now, imagine you and the family are preparing to return to the UK from a holiday or a stay abroad. You go to check in, and that's when it all goes horribly wrong. Your child has an extreme fear of flying. Your child. And they're refusing to come home. They start to hyperventilate. They shake. They're suffering from a panic attack. That's exactly what happened to Tony Thompson, who'd been working in Abu Dhabi. He was supposed to return to the UK in June last year, but his 12-year-old son, Joe, refused to leave because he suddenly decided he's petrified of flying. So Tony and the son, Joe, have been stranded there for 15 months. Tony's wife and daughter were able to return home to Weston-super-Mare. So what do you do in that circumstance if your child is afraid of flying? It was too difficult for Tony and Joe to go back by land. And in a last gasp attempt to get him home, the family contacted the hypnotherapist Russell Hemmings, who worked with Joe for 6 weeks, and he flew back to the UK yesterday. So Russell Hemmings, the hypnotherapist, joins us. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Jeremy.
And Tony Thompson in Weston-super-Mare. Back there, Tony, at long last.
Indeed, yes. It's an amazing feeling.
And you were almost trapped there.
I was trapped there. I couldn't leave, well, an 11-year-old, now 12-year-old boy there. And so, yeah, exhausted all the land and sea options. The air route seemed not going to happen. And then, fortunately, Pauline, my wife, read about Russell, and then off we started. As he said, some 6 weeks ago, and then our hopes were raised, and finally, amazingly, yesterday morning, we arrive in London. Great feeling.
So you'd been working in Abu Dhabi as a police trainer, I understand, but the contract came to an end, and you were stuck.
I was, absolutely. I mean, this is a boy who'd been travelling since he'd been a baby. He'd been Europe, backwards and forwards to Abu Dhabi every few months when the school holidays were on, been to Canada. No sign whatsoever of any sort of problem with flying, and then suddenly he developed this flight, including when I was going to take him in the rugby team over to Sri Lanka from Dubai, and just as they were going to shut the doors last March, he got up and ran off the plane. So that's when I realised we had a bit of a problem.
And what were his symptoms? What did he do when he realised he was going to have to fly initially?
He started hyperventilating. He kept saying, "I can't do this." He would get very tearful. He'd collapse on the floor. He was a mess, so much so that the cabin, the airline staff saw him out before we got on and said, "Look, we can't have him travelling like that." So that, really compounded the situation. So, but yeah, all those sort of symptoms, and he was in absolute fear.
Russell Hemmings, the hypnotherapist, you obviously saw him, you worked with him. He was clearly very frightened when you met him.
Yes, extremely frightened. He was probably one of the worst cases I've treated.
And that fear is caused by what? How would it suddenly come on? Because he'd been, as Tony says, he'd been flying for a while.
Yeah, after we did a history on Joe, we found out that during the course of his last flight, he had an ear infection, which was extremely painful, extreme pain. And when he was landing, he shared this with me, that it was so frightening for him. He thought it was aircraft that was causing it. Also, is compounded with claustrophobia, so he had a fear of being enclosed. So in an aeroplane or a car, and it started to transfer into other areas. He even got trapped. I believe Tony. He got trapped in Ski Dubai, didn't he? One of the machines broke down.
Yes, he did. In fact, it was after one of the early meetings with Russell. I took him to Ski Dubai, which is full of lots of snow in Dubai, and he went up on the ski lift, and the ski lift developed a fault, and he was suspended there for about 10 or 15 minutes, and he was, that was it. Once he got down, he wouldn't go back, so this anxiety was developing and transferring into other areas.
And so how did you work with him, Russell?
Well, I used a combination. I have a program anyway, so they know about me. In Dubai, I run a fear of flying program, and I used a combination of hypnosis, cognitive behavioural therapy and coaching. Saying that, I would normally expect one of my clients to travel on their own, but his anxiety were right off the radar. 20 years of working in this field, hadn't seen anything like it. And
so did you tell him to imagine he's on a plane, but he can't even do that?
No. What we do is, I'll try and keep it as simple as possible. In the brain, there is an area which stores memory when we reach highly emotional stages, and like fear. And when we experience a fear, it's recorded, and that recording is triggered by stimulus like visual imagery, smells, sounds. So if they're in the same environment again, it can trigger a similar stimulus, which is the fight or flight response, which has 14 different, quite frightening, terrifying feelings. And that lack of control is dreadful. Anyone not experiencing it wouldn't even know what it's like. And you can be standing next to somebody and they're going through highly emotional states, but you may not actually be able to interpret that just by visually looking at someone.
And so you train the rational part of the brain to cover it, do you?
Yeah, there's a technique I use, which we developed about 5 years ago, which actually takes the imagery, and we take something, in this case with Joe, he's got this real attachment to bikes, and there's a bike shop in his hometown, and he remembers all the pleasant smells, etc., and the visual imagery of the bikes, and we take him to that pleasant place, get that emotion he feels when he's in the shop, and then bolt that into the old memory that he used to have, so he gets this feeling and emotion. But because it was right off the radar, I made a pledge to the family I'd get him back within 6 weeks, put him through the programme, and I promised, because they'd been to a number of therapists and obviously he didn't get the result he wished, I'd deliver him home if that was needed.
So you flew with him?
Yeah, we were on the plane just hours, literally. It was just
so you had
yesterday.
to almost counsel him during the flight?
Yeah, there was he melted down for a short while during waiting for the aircraft, and actually on the aircraft we flew Pauline back home. That recommendation, we wanted a parent to catch him when he arrived back in England, and also I asked Tony, and that was really difficult for Tony, to just back off and let me do what I do. And I asked Tony, look, just get on the plane, I'll deal with it. And it was quite traumatic for the young boy and for his father.
And so you're asking him essentially to visualise the bike shop when he gets afraid?
Well, what happened was he went into a panic attack while waiting for the plane. I'd put some post-hypnotic suggestions into his mind prior, over the 6-week course, as a backup to my work, and I induced a hypnotic trance prior, walked him onto the plane.
Does that work?
And obviously he's back in the country, isn't he? But the reality is, once he was on the plane, he started to get panicky when the door was closing, because that was a secondary problem, his claustrophobia. So I had to put him into a deeper state of hypnosis, and during that hypnosis the plane took off and he was fine. As soon as he was up in the air, no problems.
Tony, that's an amazing story, isn't it?
Yes, it is. I'm so grateful that we found Russell. As I say, I'd run out of all options, and I thought we were going to be there forever. But yeah, he worked his magic, and you know, of course, Joe is so grateful to, as we all are, for Russell's help, because there was just no end in sight. There wasn't a light at the end of the tunnel. There wasn't even a tunnel.
What if you'd gone back by land? What would you have had to do?
Well, we would have gone through Saudi Arabia, and then probably originally looking through Syria, or possibly into Iraq, Syria, and Egypt, and then get across from Egypt into Europe. And I've been exploring all the options, but every one carried with it dangers. Last year, a major car manufacturer in Europe offered to drive us back, and when their security found the routes that were available, they had to pull it because it was too dangerous. So you'd have to do Syria, Egypt, Iraq. On my head.
Yeah, I can see how that would be very, very difficult. There was so Syria, Egypt, Iraq, or all three. Is that right?
Well, I think the route would have touched or gone through all of them. I mean, we were, you know, the route I was looking at was going through Aleppo and Homs, and then we looked at Syria. I mean, it was just too difficult, and I was prepared to take the chance, but Joe. I think Joe was hearing me planning it. He saw my maps on the wall, and he was seeing all these routes. He'd heard about all these bad stories along the way, and I think that just made him sort of just close down and said, "Look, I just can't do this."
How's he doing now?
He's great. In fact, his mum's just taken him out to get him his bike that he's been after. After visualising it in the plane coming back, he's now saying, "Well, where's my bike?"
Good. Well, that's a lovely homecoming. Thanks, Tony. Great story.
Thank you very much, Jeremy.
Tony Thompson.
Thank you, Russell. Cheers.
Police trainer in Weston-super-Mare, father of Joe, who's back safe, and Russell Hemmings, the hypnotherapist who got him back.